You may have encountered the phrase, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. But are you familiar who said this? A pleasant day, everyone. We are Group 3. I am Angelica RENDOR along with Janna NUQUI and Rovic TAPERLA. Today we will focus on reading 3 with particular attention to Jeremy Bentham, the individual behind the aforementioned quote. Our discussion will revolve around 5 primary objectives. Firstly, to acquaint ourselves with the background of Jeremy Bentham. Secondly, to grasp the concept of principles of utility. Thirdly, to explore the principle that adheres to the principle of utility. Fourthly, to grasp the 4 functions of pleasure and pain. And lastly, to delve into the methodology for quantifying pleasure and pain. Let's start our exploration by delving into the life and contribution of Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was born on February 15, 1748 and died at the age of 84 on June 6, 1832. He was born into a legal household, but he spent much of his childhood in the countryside homes of his grandmothers. Bentham was an English philosopher, economist, and a legal theorist. Aside from this, Bentham was also regarded as the first and most prominent proponent of utilitarianism. Bentham's first venture into writing was through his book entitled A Fragment on Government, which was published in 1776. Despite his unfulfilled political ambition in 1788, Bentham conducted a detailed analysis of legislative principles, which led to publishing on his book entitled An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislations in 1789. The piece serves as a platform for presenting Bentham's philosophical and ethical philosophy, which is based on the principle of utility, the foundation of utilitarianism. Bentham sought to clarify the idea of utility as an object's ability to seek pleasure or avoid pain. Further exploration of this will be addressed throughout the presentation, so let's now proceed to the first chapter.
Now that we have familiarized Jeremy Bentham's life, let us proceed to the discussion proper, starting with the first chapter entitled The Principle of Utility. Bentham stated that in accordance to natural law, mankind is governed by 2 sovereign masters, namely the pain and the pleasure. According to his philosophy, these forces intertwine into every dimension of our actions, words, and thoughts. In fact, they point out what we ought to do and determine what we shall do. They serve as the standard of right and wrong, and the chain of causes and effects. While there may be instances where individuals reject this notion, Bentham argued that most of the time humans are unconsciously driven to follow the influence of pleasure and pain. Interestingly, he asserted that in most occasions of human life, we often adopt this principle as the basis of our moral behavior without even thinking about it. To further understand, let's uncover the root principle of this basis of behavior. The principle of utility is said to recognize subjection or dominance of man. It implies that the approval or disapproval of every action is based on the amount of pleasure or pain it brings. Jeremy Bentham equates pleasure with good and pain with evil. If your action causes pleasure or happiness, then it is good. Meanwhile, if your action brought you pain, then it is bad or evil. By utility, this principle aims to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness, while preventing the events of mischief, pain, evil, suffering, or unhappiness. It teaches people to embrace joy and evade hardship, because the main goal of this principle is to achieve the greatest amount of well-being or pleasure, underscoring that the action promoting the most happiness is the most moral behavior. Moreover, the principle of utility disregards individual distinctions, and instead, it directs the attention towards the collective whole. By the word of every action means that we will not only focus on private individuals, but also on the government and or the communities. Any act should always intend to achieve the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. Ito na nga yung quote na sinasabi ni Angel sa introduction a while ago. Given that we're talking about the greatest number of people, let us now shift our discussion to the interest of the community. This is said to be one of the most general expressions in the terminology of morals, kung kaya naman ay madalas maligaw ang tunay na kahulugan nito. However, as defined by Bentham, community is a fictitious body composed of the individuals who are thought of as its integral constituents or members. So, this implies that it is pointless to discuss the interests of the community without understanding first what the interest of the individual is. Ayon nga ay dahil ang mga individual na miyembro ang bumubuo sa isang komunidad. Furthermore, principle of utility is an evaluation of action based on its effect on the happiness of those affected by it. An action is deemed to foster the interests of an individual when it contributes to the sum of their overall pleasures or when it mitigates the cumulative impact of their pains. Correspondingly, an action aligns with the principle of utility when its inclination to increase the happiness of the entire community surpasses any inclination it may have to diminish it. Simply stated, umaayon sa principle na to ang collective actions of individuals kung ang epekto nito sa komunidad ay nagdudulot ng mas mataas na level na kaligayahan at hindi ito nakapagbibigay ng dahilan para mabawasan yung pleasure na yon. Applying this principle in real-life scenarios may lead to a realization that valuing individual perspectives is crucial in making decisions to the whole community. Without prioritizing and ensuring the happiness of individuals, sustaining the overall happiness of the community becomes unattainable. Likewise, this principle extends to governmental measures, as they constitute a specific type of action executed by one or more individuals. Kaya nga mayroon tayong branches of government who checks and balances the actions and suggestions of each department. Ganon din sa paggawa ng batas. Meron tayong mga Senate at House of Representatives sa Congress na nagbobotohan when making decisions regarding law. Another basic and simple example is when doing group works. Hindi dapat opinion ng isa lang ang masunod na desisyon, kundi dapat ay kagustuhan ng lahat o ng nakararami.
When someone thinks that an action conforms to the principle of utility, he may find it convenient for purposes of discourse. In addition, he may find it convenient for purposes of discourse to either imagine a kind of law or dictate of utility, or speak of the action in question as conforming to such a law or dictate. Let's talk about the concept of partisan. Partisan happens when a person's approval or disapproval of any action regarding governmental measure is fixed by and proportional to the tendency the person thinks it has to increase or lessen the community's happiness. Moving on, one may always say that an action conforms to the principle of utility if it ought to be done, or at least that it is not something that ought not to be done. One may also say that it is right that it should be done. It is a right action, or at least that it is not wrong that it should be done. It is not a wrong action. In simple terms, the words ought and right and wrong and others of that sort have a meaning. Otherwise, they have none. Furthermore, has the rightness of this principle ever been formally contested? We have two answers to this question. First, it should seem that it had, by those who have not known what they have been meaning. Another, it seems to have been contested, by people who didn't understand what they were contesting. On the contrary, is it susceptible of any direct proof? It seems not, because something that is used to prove everything else can itself be proved. A chain of proofs must start somewhere. To give such a proof is as impossible as it is needless. Let's now discuss the concept of the natural constitution of human fame. Basically, the concept of the natural constitution of human fame suggests that most people instinctively adhere to this principle in their lives, whether consciously or unconsciously, as they evaluate their own actions and those of others. However, not many individuals fully embrace this principle without reservation. Many may struggle to understand or apply it consistently due to various prejudices or attachments. Ultimately, the passage reflects on the human tendency towards inconsistency, highlighting it as a rare quality to maintain consistency in principle and practice. When a man tries to combat the principle of utility, his reasons are drawn from that very principle itself. If his arguments prove anything, it isn't that the principle is wrong, but that he is applying it wrongly. For example, is it possible for a man to move the earth? The answer is yes, but he must find first out another earth to stand on. In continuation, there is a method for individuals who are skeptical or resistant towards the principle of utility to reconsider their stance. It suggests a series of steps for such individuals to take. First, decide whether they truly want to discard the principle of utility altogether, considering the consequences of doing so. Next, if they believe they have found another principle to judge and act by, they should critically examine whether it is a distinct and coherent principle or merely a verbal flourish expressing personal statements. Next, consider whether personal disapproval, detached from consequences, can serve as a sufficient basis for judgment and action, and whether this sentiment should be the standard for everyone. Next, reflect on implications of adopting a mixed view, incorporating both personal principles and the principles of utility, and determine where to draw the line and why. Lastly, consider alternative principles besides utility and evaluate whether they offer a legitimate motive for action, distinct from those based on utility. Overall, the passage encourages individuals to critically assess their objections to the principle of utility and explore its implication in comparison to other possible guiding principles.
The second chapter is entitled Of Principles Adheres to That of Utility. This chapter reviews the claims of Bentham in his theory of morality, utilitarianism. The principle of utility defines an act or behavior as good if it promotes pleasure or happiness, and evil if it causes pain or suffering. If utilitarianism is seen as a proper principle to follow in all cases, then any principle that deviates from it must be considered wrong. In this chapter, two principles will be discussed where it confuses the principle of utility. The first principle is the principle of asceticism, which continuously contradicts the principle of utility. Any philosophy that directly violates the principle of utility is considered asceticism. While the principle of utility strives to maximize the overall happiness or pleasure for the greatest number of people, it is the other way around for the principle of asceticism, for it seeks acts that results in the least happiness or pleasure for the greatest number of people. Some people believe that pleasure itself is unpleasant and that experiencing suffering is preferable. This perspective is shown by deserve ko ba to mentality, in which one is hesitant to reward oneself with pleasure, such as buying an ice cream after a test, owing to doubts about their performance. Instead of pursuing pleasure, they chose self-imposed pain. This idea is supported by two classes of men, moralists and religionists. Moralists are motivated by their hope of gaining authority and credibility among others, as well as they're driven by hope. Moralists includes educators and philosophers. Religionists, on the other hand, are motivated by fear, namely the fear of being punished in the future by a furious deity. Religionists includes Buddhists and monks who withhold from pleasure through disciplines like fasting and abstinence as a matter of merit and obligation, seeking pain. Although these two parties are different and their reasons are different, they are all in the same principle. Additionally, Bentham claims that two classes of men would naturally intermingle as the man will not recognize which of the two impacted him more. Because of their similarities in distinguishing everything linked to pleasure, they formed an alliance and united against a shared enemy. Those who adopted this branding are known as the Epicureans, and they believe that pleasure is the only thing that people wanted to discover or like.
Aside from what Angel mentioned, we also have here the principles of sympathy and antipathy. Sympathy encompasses the emotions that we feel for others, fostering a sense of compassion or sorrow whenever we witness their misfortunes. This emotional connection often influences our perception of an action, as we tend to view that actions that evoke our sympathy as morally positive. Conversely, antipathy introduces the notion of dislike. If we find ourselves disapproving or having an aversion to an action, it is deemed as morally negative. This principle underscores the subjective nature of morality, wherein personal feelings and preferences contribute to the judgment and the evaluation of right and wrong. In general, principles of sympathy and antipathy introduce an emotional dimension, which shapes our moral judgments based on our emotional responses to actions and their consequences. It relies on feelings, personal feelings to be exact, in making moral decisions. It is based on what we feel about a certain action, based on our intuition, our conscience, our common sense, and our understanding. It is said that this is a principle in the name rather than in reality, because this is not a good basis for moral or legislation. Indeed, the principle of sympathy and antipathy, while named as a principle, is often criticized for being more subjective than substantive. This approach to morality and legislation is faulted for its lack of reliance on external evidence or objective criteria. The subjective nature of these principles introduces an element of arbitrariness and potential injustice, particularly in the realm of criminal punishment. Here, if you hate much, you punish much. If you hate little, you punish little. Punish as you hate. This not only opens the door to inconsistency, but also risks the creation of legal system that is driven more by personal emotions than reasoned and fair judgment. Using this principle, we only consult our own feelings. Thus, the reliance on personal feelings as the sole basis of moral and legislative decisions raises concern about objectivity and impartiality. Critics also argued that a more robust and evidence-based approach is essential to ensure a just and equitable legal system, one that is not swayed by the whims or emotions of individuals, but rather grounded in fair and consistent application of the law. Lastly, we have here the theological principle. When Bentham was writing this book, religion is intrinsically tied to morality, kung kaya't kinakailangan niyang i-discuss yung aspect na to. Under this principle, sinasabi na nakabatay sa will of God yung standard of right and wrong. This perspective implies that moral judgments are contingent upon the divine guidance and the adherence to religious doctrines. The idea of this principle is that the will of God serves as the ultimate moral compass, reflecting the prevailing moral landscape of that time, wherein yung mga religious authorities they often played central role in shaping the ethical standards. Katulad ng nasabi ko kanina, this principle is an obtainment of divine guidance, kung saan humans cannot precisely know what the will of God is, because written documents require too much interpretation. You cannot know which interpretation is correct. Also, Bentham highlighted the challenges and limitations associated with relying solely on divine will as the foundation of morality. That's why, according to Bentham, this principle is not a distinct principle. Halimbawa, if you believe in God, you will do what God wants you to do. At syempre, ayun ang mga mabuting gawain. And similarly, you'll be scared to disobey His will. Ngayon, this sense of being afraid is considered pain. Kaya to avoid that, you will just continue to obey God and do good things to lessen the possibility of pain or afraidness na nararamdaman mo, which is somehow the principle of utility. Bentham contends that while this principle appears to align with the concept of utility, it is in fact a misapplication. Tinatawag niya itong principle of utility misapplied, wherein the means lies in the human tendency to avoid suffering rather than actually seeking pleasure. In here, individuals under the principle may be more inclined to follow moral judgments to avoid potential consequences or afraidness associated with the disobedience rather than actively pursuing pleasure. In continuation, if you believe that God desires human suffering, this perspective is now aligning with the principle of asceticism. Asceticism in a religious or philosophical context advocates for self-discipline, restraint, and even self-inflicted suffering as a means of attaining spiritual or moral growth. On the other hand, if you perceive God as an arbitrary, which makes decisions based on personal preferences rather than adhering to consistent moral code, it corresponds to the principle of sympathy and antipathy. In this context, moral judgments are shaped by personal likes or dislikes, reflecting a more subjective and individualistic approach to ethics. Consequently, for this chapter, Bentham's examination of these principles prompts individuals to critically assess the ethical underpinnings of our beliefs.
Moving forward, let us now discuss Chapter 3, the four sanctions or sources of pain and pleasure. Legislators should prioritize the happiness of individuals within a community, considering both pleasure and security. Legislation should be crafted to shape behavior towards this goal, acknowledging that people are primarily driven by the pursuit of pleasure or the avoidance of pain. The concept of pleasure and pain is broadened to encompass four sources, which are physical, political, moral, and religious. These sources provide what are termed as sanctions, which give binding force to laws or rules of conduct. Physical sanctions arise naturally. Political sanctions are dispensed by chosen individuals or authorities. Moral sanctions stem from personal connections within the community, and religious sanctions come from a superior invisible being, either in the present or future life. These sanctions serve as both final goals to be aimed and as effective means to influence behavior. Furthermore, pleasures or pains stemming from physical, political, or moral sanctions are anticipated to be felt in the present life, whereas those from religious sanctions may extend into either the present or a future life. Pleasures and pains experienced in the present life are experienced by human nature's capabilities and can emerge from diverse sources, encompassing the full spectrum of human experience. There are no inherent disparities between the pleasures and pains arising from various sources. Rather, their distinctions are solely based on the circumstances accompanying them. There are different scenarios of harm or loss experienced by individuals, categorized by their causes. First, calamity, harm occurring accidentally. Second, punishment of the physical sanction, harm due to the individual's own negligence. Third, punishment of the political sanction, harm resulting from a sentence by a political magistrate. Fourth, punishment of the moral sanction, harm due to someone else's refusal to help based on moral judgment. Lastly, punishment of the religious sanction, perceived harm as a result of divine displeasure due to sin or fear thereof. The religious sanction encompasses promises of pleasures and pains in a future life. However, since these experiences are beyond our observation, their nature remains unknown. In the present life, they are merely matters of expectation. Whether these expectations stem from natural religion or revelation, the specific qualities of these pleasures or pains escape our understanding. Our ideas regarding them are silent concerning their quality, and any other aspects of our ideas about them will be further explored later. On the other hand, the physical sanction serves as the foundation for the political, moral, and religious sanctions, particularly in relation to the present life. It is encompassed within each of the other three sanctions and can function independently of them, while none of them can operate except through it. Essentially, The powers of nature can operate independently, but the magistrate and individuals in general can only operate through the powers of nature. Similarly, it is assumed that God's effects on us in our present life also operate through the powers of nature. It is beneficial to establish a common name for the four similar concepts previously discussed. This serves two primary purposes. First, providing a convenient label for certain pleasures and pains that lack equally descriptive names. Another, highlighting the effectiveness of certain moral forces that might otherwise be overlooked. For instance, the political sanction, along with the moral and religious sanctions, influences human behavior. Political authorities regularly encounter the impacts of these moral and religious forces, which can either support or hinder their actions. It is crucial for political leaders to recognize and consider these forces in their decision-making processes to prevent miscalculations. Therefore, having a common name for a sanction for these concepts helps underscore their relevance to political purposes and objectives.
Let us now explore the fourth chapter, Measuring Pleasure and Pain. Bentham believed that humankind's main goal is to seek pleasure while avoiding pain. It is an instinct. We are unaware why we do it, but we still do it because it is part of our nature. But how do we measure pleasure and pain? Bentham defined the value of pleasure and pain for an individual about an event using the four aspects: intensity, duration, certainty, and nearness, which is also known as propinquity. These four aspects assesses the value of both pain and pleasure as they are. Intensity refers to the degree of pleasure or pain. When we overthink something, we think about how happy we will be or how happy people around us will be if we do this particular action. Similarly, how upset would I or the people around me be if I did this particular action? Pleasure can be described as more than just happiness, and pain as more than sadness. Duration, on the other hand, describes how long a pleasure or pain will last. Will it endure for an hour, a month, or a year? Will it be temporary, or will it last long? For example, you had an argument with your friend. Will that pain of yours last for an hour, or much longer? The next aspect is certainty, which relates to the likelihood that an activity will cause pleasure or pain. For example, if we aim for the sublime, are we convinced that studying hard and meeting all the requirements will reward us with that pleasure? Lastly, nearness or propinquity, which indicates how far away pleasure or pain will be in the future. It's as if we're wondering whether performing such things would offer us pleasure or pain. For example, while deciding whether to see your mother with whom you had lost touch for a long period of time due to family troubles, we would consider whether we would feel pleasure or pain if we saw her again. Moving on, if you would like to assess the probability of pleasure and pain in an act, we have two more aspects: fecundity and purity. Fecundity is the probability of being followed by an additional encounter of the same type. Pleasure by pleasure, pain by pain. While purity is the absence of the opposing sense. Pain by pleasure and pleasure by pain. To make it easier, I'll give you an example for each. Beginning with fecundity. Assume you are painting, and painting brings us pleasure. How certain are we that continuing to paint will offer us the same pleasure? And similarly to pain. Will we feel the same pain even if we do it repeatedly? Now, purity. I would like to explain it using the famous statement, "Do not do unto others what you do not want them to do to you." For example, you get pleasure from pranking people, but you don't know how they feel as a consequence of your actions. And when they take their revenge on you, you suffer pain in the process. This is what purity is. Another example is judging people, which it gives you pleasure, yet being insulted back causes you pain. However, fecundity and purity are not precisely characteristics of pleasure and pain, as they simply describe the tendency of how it was produced rather than the value of pleasure and pain. Again, it only describes the tendency of pleasure and pain and not the value. Now that we covered the 6 aspects that measures the value and the tendency of pleasure and pain for an individual, let us now move on to the value of pleasure and pain for a group. We understand that there are 4 aspects for determining the value of pleasure and pain: intensity, duration, certainty, and nearness. Furthermore, the 2 aspects, fecundity and purity, assesses tendencies, and along with this, it also measures pleasure and pain in the community. The last aspect is the extent, which is crucial in determining how many people will be affected by an act that causes pleasure and pain. In posting an opinion on social media, how many individuals would feel the pleasure by their action or how many individuals would feel pain.
To further elucidate, when discussing in terms of individuals, fecundity and purity indicates a tendency. However, when viewed in the context of the community, fecundity and purity are now regarded as integral properties in measuring the value of pleasure and pain that the community experiences. Therefore, the evaluation of impact of an action on the community's interests is assessed based on the following processes. First, measure the value of each pleasure that appears to be produced by an action in the first instance. This can be called as the first immediate and direct pleasure. For example, imagine you started to exercise. The instant good feeling that you get from a jog and the sense of achievement in finishing a lap is the first quick and direct happiness. Second, measure the value of each pain that appears to be produced by an action in the first instance. This can be called as the first immediate and direct pain. In continuation sa jogging example kanina, the initial direct discomfort you might feel is the tiredness or muscle soreness you feel immediately after your first jog. Third, measure the value of each pleasure that appears to be produced by an action after the first, or simply, the secondary pleasurable outcomes. Ito yung fecundity of the first immediate direct pleasure and impurity of the first immediate direct pain. For instance, after the initial joy of completing the jog, your first jog, the second round happy outcome might include the feeling of being more energetic throughout the day, and sa gabi naman, you get better sleep. While the initial discomfort could be minimal, like a little tiredness that fades away quickly. Fourth, measure the value of each pain that appears to be produced by an action after the first. Again, kabaliktaran lang to ng third measure. Simply, this is the secondarily painful outcomes. The fecundity of the first immediate direct pain, and the impurity of the first immediate direct pleasure. For example, after the initial muscle soreness na naramdaman mo, yung second round discomfort naman might include prolonged pain or fatigue. While the not so pleasant part of the initial joy that you felt is the pressure to maintain the same level of achievement in your subsequent jogs, leading to further stress. Fifth, measure the values of all the pleasures on one side and of all the pains on the other. Like a mathematical equation, add the pleasure and then subtract the pain. If the sum is in favor on the side of pleasure, then that is an overall positive tendency of the act concerning the interest of that person. Conversely, if the result tilts toward pain, then it indicates an overall adverse or negative tendency. Now, extending the evaluation to the community involves repeating the 5 processes for individual measurements, ending it by adding up all individual results to provide an overall community outcome. If the result weighs heavier on pleasure, then it signifies a positive overall tendency of the act concerning the community's interest, and is considered morally right or acceptable. Oppositely, if it weighs heavier on pain, then it indicates a bad or negative overall tendency which concerns the community's interest, and is considered morally wrong. An illustrative example of this concept is the practice of waste segregation. People's motivation to comply with this rule can be influenced by pain and pleasure. Pain associated with the fatigue or inconvenience of separating trash, and then pleasure derived from the benefits of having flood-resistant area and a cleaner environment. Pinapakita lang nito na certain actions, when assessed from individual perspectives, might appear to only induce pain. However, when viewed in a broader lens, considering the perspective of the entire community, these individual pains may collectively contribute to a substantial pleasure for the surrounding community. It's just a matter of sacrificing minor discomfort to attain significant overall satisfaction. Nevertheless, Jeremy Bentham noted that it is unrealistic to expect these processes to be applied before every moral judgment, legislative decisions, or judicial operations. Due to practical constraints, formal calculation may not always be feasible. Hence, there are instances where estimation becomes crucial and necessary. Pero tulad nga ng ibang mga pilosopo, Bentham emphasized that the principle can always be kept in view. Patuloy lang ito na consider because the closer the processes actually pursued on specific real-life scenarios which aligns to the principle, then the closer our decisions will come to preciseness.
Thus, this process is applicable to pleasure and pain in whatever form they appear, and by whatever name they are labeled. To pleasure, whether it be called good, that is properly the cause or instrument of pleasure; profit, that is distant pleasure, or the cause or instrument of distant pleasure; convenience or advantage, benefit, happiness, and so forth. to pain, whether is it called evil that corresponds to good, mischief or inconvenience, or disadvantage, or loss or unhappiness, and so forth. In conclusion, the principle of utility is neither new nor unjustified, nor is it useless. Instead, it reflects the natural tendency of people to pursue their own interests when they have a clear understanding of them. It emphasizes the ability of this principle to enable individuals to generate various pleasures and avoid pains. People typically focus on the duration and certainty of attaining their interests rather than the intensity, fecundity, or purity of the pleasures derived from them. These aspects depend on how individuals choose to use the principle, which cannot be determined until specific pleasures or pains are considered.
And with that, our presentation ends here. Hope you gained something from our discussion. Thank you for listening and have a great day ahead.